I want to say this right to set the record straight about something because I think a lot of people like to look at us, the LDBC or the Lions Den basketball community, as villains. You know what I'm saying? And that's fine. You know, I I can embrace that to a certain extent, but I want to set the record straight. Okay, when me and Ticket TV and LB and Mahari and a couple of other brothers, when we started defending Allen Iverson, even if we disagree about where to rank him and all that, right? But what we were initially, you know, going against was actually a channel that I think is bigger than us as far as subscribers, Basketball Examiner. And he made a couple of videos where he was saying that AI is one of, if not the most overrated players in the history of the NBA. And I disagree with that. Okay. And it was strictly about basketball. It wasn't personal. But, over time, things get twisted and people, for whatever reason, they'll try to make it about something else. And all of a sudden, we became Iverson fanboys. It's just silliness, right? But I want to make one last, well, at least for right now, because it's not going to be the last video, I know it. But I want to make one last video for right now, trying to explain why AI's field goal percentage was actually very good considering the circumstance that he was in. Okay. Now, one thing that has to be noted is think about all the players that played during that time period. Think about something. Allen Iverson. It has to be something. Allen Iverson, Tracy McGrady, Vince Carter, Kobe Bryant, Paul Pierce. There's something that they all had in common, and that is they seldom, if ever, shot over 50% from the floor in the season. Jerry Stackhouse is in the equation as well. As a matter of fact, not only did they not shoot 50% or more, they weren't even close to it. I think Kobe never had a season even shooting 47%, and AI never had a season shooting 46%. I think I said Jimmy Carter. Hello, I'm Jimmy Carter. I'm running for president. Vince Carter never had a season, I think, shooting 47% or greater, or at least 48%. But I think he was usually in the mid 40s. Even Paul Pierce, the first several years of his career, was usually around 44 to 46% from the floor. Jerry Stackhouse was an extreme example. Even though he was 6'6" and blessed with athleticism, he was never a great shooter. And he usually shot around 40%, upper 30s, 40%. Finished his career shooting about 40.8%. Um, and there's some other guys. Now, there were some guys that could shoot the basketball very well. But for the most part, they didn't shoot a very high percentage during these years. But it wasn't just limited to them because they were the great scorers of the time, the great perimeter scorers. Perimeter scorers. Now, what is it that's keeping them from shooting a higher percentage as guys are today? Well, it was the way that the NBA was constructed at the time and the rules that were implemented. Now, starting in the mid 1990s, they did start trying to do away with hand checking, but defensive players made adjustments, and in some ways, they actually the game became even more physical because now instead of guys using their hands, they used other tricks. They started using their elbows. They started doing things to try to knock guys off stride. They were being more physical, and they made adjustments. The game slowed down. The pace of game slowed down. Remember, the NBA is a copycat league. And remember, I've said this before. In the late 1990s, the NBA became an old man's league. The best teams in the NBA were the Chicago Bulls, who had the oldest average age in the NBA, 32, 33 years old. Then you had, Jordan was 34, 35, Pippen 32, 33, Rodman 36, 37, Harper 33, 34. The Houston Rockets were still a threat. They were an older team, even though they did add Patino Mobley and Michael Dickinson, I think, by that time, but it was still an older team. Um, Utah, old team. Stockton and Malone, mid late 30s. But they were a great team. They beat teams by high IQ basketball and efficiency, and outplaying teams down the stretch. These young Lions, they were, great on paper, but they just didn't have the experience yet. But it was a slower paced basketball. And, there was a trend toward defense that we truly saw in the late 90s into the 2000s. I would say from 1998 to about 2004 was the greatest defensive period in the history of the NBA, at least since the uh, addition of the shot clock. Now, you had lower scoring seasons before that, but a lot of that was more due to basketball still being its more primitive stages, and it's just not. It wasn't the best quality basketball in the way they played. There was no shot clock, so there was nothing to speed the game up. We had a shot clock, and yet you still had teams averaging 83 points a game. Whereas today you have teams that can average as much as 115 or so points or more per game. So it's a totally different game. You still had an NBA that in 1999, 14 of the top 20 scorers were big men. Today it's maybe two guys, Giannis and Joel Embiid. Off the top of my head, maybe I'm forgetting somebody, but mainly that's about it. Everybody are perimeter guys who are the big scorers in the NBA. Even Pascal Siakam isn't averaging 20 points a game, more like 17, 18, I think, somewhere in that range. So it's a totally different NBA. Back then, bigs were still dominant in the NBA. You had bigs that, and this is another thing. Um, you saw not only bigs, but bigs who were exceptional on the defensive end. Whether you're talking about Theo Ratliff or Dikembe Mutombo or a Marcus Camby, who eventually won Defensive Player of the Year. Um, Alonzo Mourning. You saw an NBA that was totally geared toward defense. That's when also you saw a glut of defensive specialists like Roger Bell and Bruce Bowen. Guys like that. You know, you saw an NBA, Ron Artest, Ben Wallace, another big man that I forgot to mention that was a defensive specialist, right? That was the NBA then. It was almost the inverse of what we have today. What has happened is that there were rule changes made, motivated by, to me, two reasons. Number one, the fact that ratings were beginning to suffer because of the style of play. The 2005 NBA Finals, to me, were one of the greatest finals ever to watch if you love the way basketball was played back then. But the league wanted a flashier, up and down, more pleasing style of basketball for casuals. And we've seen that. But it's come at the expense of losing a lot of hardcore basketball fans. You know what I'm saying? And also the malice at the palace. It created a black eye for the league, and the NBA has tried to make some changes. You know what I'm saying? And they also it's some politics involved in that as well. Okay, they did away with hand checking totally. No tricks, no gimmicks, and defensive players are now relegated to try to play defense with your feet, trying to stay in front of guys, which with the athletes today is very difficult to do. It's very difficult to really play sound defense like that. I mean, playing defense like that in the NBA with guys who have so many different ways of scoring, it's nearly impossible. With the dribbling ability, the way guys, the lateral quickness, the speed guys have today, it's next to impossible to stop a great offensive player. And when you combine that with the fact that you don't have bigs down low as much anymore, and that's why a lot of these guys are able to get so many rebounds and the pace of the game. No wonder triple doubles are out of control now. You know what I'm saying? It's a perfect recipe for guys to get triple doubles. But a lot of people don't know what the fuck they're talking about when they're talking about basketball. You know what I'm saying? But back to the point I'm trying to make. The game opened up. The traditional big disappeared like dinosaurs. And the freedom of movement rule was sort of like the final thing. Like, I mean, you now can't do anything really to knock a shooter or score a shooter off stride. And that's why we see these games now where, the final score is 151, 149, 133, 137. I'm not saying we never saw any of those games, but it might have happened once a year or once every other year, as opposed to we see it every week. We see one of these games, 133, 137, or more so. So it's not the same league. Let's look at the numbers. Effective field goal, effective field goal percentage is over 53% league wide. That's the highest it's ever been in the history of the NBA since 1946, since the league existed, when it was actually before the NBA, when it was the BAA and the NBL. The second highest field goal percentage, effective field goal percentage, last year. The third highest the year before that. Field goal percentage. The average field goal percentage is 46.7%. It's tied for two other seasons. One season, I think, was 94 95, and that's when they brought the 3-point line in an attempt to raise scoring. And I think one year in the 70s, I think, or in the 80s, was 46.7%. When you had the Lakers who never took threes and shit, and who you had guys who were shooting threes, and the 3-point line was his infancy. Other than those seasons, to this year's 46.7% is the highest it's ever been in the history of the league. The league average is 112 points a game. The highest it's been in 50 years. Pace is almost 100. The highest has been since at least the 80s. So it is very, very easy to score the basketball, as opposed to when AI won the MVP in 2001. Uh, Effective field goal percentage was like 46, 47, which is far, far lower. Far lower. Like for a league wide thing, that's way down. Average field goal percentage is around 44%. Pace was like, I think, at 90 or a little bit less than that. I think a little bit less than that. And points per game, I think, were like 94. So it was a totally different league. The best teams were, of course, the Lakers, but they did have good team defense. The Spurs, the Sixers, and on the horizon, the Detroit Pistons, and the Pacers. They were all great defensive teams. But I want to specifically talk about Allen Iverson. Okay. Now, if you notice anything about the Philadelphia 76ers, for the most part, there are some exceptions. Dana Barros, Jeff Hornacek, maybe even Tony Kukoc for a little bit. But with those few exceptions, one thing I remember from even back then in high school when I was following the NBA, right? I noticed that the Sixers were one of, if not the poorest three-point shooting team even back then. They were one of the poorest three-point shooting teams back then. Chicago, you look, they've had three-point shooters. Where you're talking about B.J. Armstrong or Craig Hodges or John Paxson, Steve Kerr, Judd Bushler could knock them down. Kukoc could knock them down. Jordan had seasons where he shot the three-pointer very well. Pippen could knock them down. The Houston Rockets, they had a lot of, even though people say that Olajuwon didn't have help, but he did have shooters around him. Whether you're talking about Mario Ellie or Vernon Maxwell could hit the three, or whether you're talking about Kenny Smith, who was a great three-point shooter. You know, um, Robert Ory was a good three-point shooter. Uh, Later on, he had guys like I think Katino Mobley could shoot threes. Michael Dickerson, Matt Bullard, Tracy Murray. So he had guys on that team that could shoot threes. Um, Even Utah, who did not shoot threes at all. Like, I think in 97, 98, they averaged like maybe 9, 10 threes a game. They didn't really shoot the three very frequently, but even they had John Stockton and Jeff Hornacek. They had guys that you had to respect, defenses had to respect and keep an eye on. Whereas the Sixers, they never really had that, especially during Iverson's peak. Now, he did play with Tony Kukoc for a little while in 99 into 2000, but Kukoc was gone by 2000, 2001. I think he went to play with Atlanta Hawks. And you can argue that it actually hurt their offense. The numbers show that when Kukoc left that team, offensively, it did something to the flow of their offense. Because Kukoc did help to stretch the floor a little bit. But when he left, and they tried to focus on being a defensive orientated team with AI handling almost the gut load of the offense, it worked. But, offensively, they were not the most efficient team. And they won primarily based on their defense. Okay? And I'm not arguing that. I'm not arguing that they didn't have a great defense. But offensively, the guys around AI were not that good. Now, initially they had Theo Ratliff, but he got hurt. And because of expediency, the Sixers made that trade for Dikembe Mutombo. They rolled the dice, got Mutombo, and Mutombo did help to take them to the finals. But without a three-point shooter, defense is keyed in on AI. So AI, who took about 25 shots a game that year, and usually led the NBA field goal attempts, he got the green light to score and shoot. But he often had to take difficult shots. If you watched AI, he was often double teamed, and he had to get his shots off against quality defense. You know what I'm saying? It wasn't easy for AI. AI had to work hard. So this is the difference. And this is why I find it difficult to compare Allen Iverson to scorers up to date. I'm not going to name any names, okay? Because I don't want to cause any more of that bullshit. But it's difficult because these guys are just pulling up and shooting now. AI had to work really hard to get his points. AI had to work like a son of a bitch for his 50-point games or for his 40-point games or even his 30-point games. He had to take it to the rack, you know, get pounded. He was a tough motherfucker. That's why those players from Shaq on down have so much respect for Allen Iverson. Michael Jordan has a lot of respect for Allen Iverson. You know what I'm saying? But it was difficult. Also, when AI was playing, he never had a superstar secondary star. You know, when he was playing, who was his secondary scorer? Whether it was, Tony Kukoc, who is a decent player, and he is a Hall of Fame player. I'm not saying his credentials when you include overseas. He's a Hall of Fame caliber player. But when it comes to the NBA on a championship team, Kukoc is at best a third option, as we saw with Chicago. He was AI's secondary option. He probably was AI's best player in a lot of ways. But look, the second best players on that team when AI was there, going back to when he first got there, you're talking about Jerry Stackhouse, who could not shoot threes, who could not shoot. He could score, but he was even more inefficient than Iverson, despite being 6'6", 215. And once he lost his athleticism, Jerry Stackhouse fell apart as an offensive player. He went from averaging 30 points a game to, being a guy coming off the bench. Derek Coleman. And we're not even talking about 91 version of Coleman. We're talking about the 270-pound version of Coleman who, was fat and lazy. That's not a guy that's going to, that's a guy, maybe if you come off the bench, you might be a great team, but not as a secondary option. And that's about it. I mean, for his prime, I mean, who was the secondary scorer on that team? Uh, Aaron McKee. Uh, you get where I'm going with this? He didn't really have anybody else like that. Shaq had Kobe. Kobe had Shaq. Jordan had Pippen. You know, other guys have great players. AI didn't have that. Now, I've seen some people say, "Oh, well, he had Iggy." That was much later on. That was much later on. That was like 2005 beyond, and that was when Iverson was that team was no longer a championship level team. And Chris Webber, that was 2008. Chris Webber was done. I think the Sixers were one of the last teams he played with. After that knee injury, Webber wasn't the same dude. He wasn't putting up 27 and 13. You gotta get your timeline correct. So the Sixers were a great defensive team. And yes, Aaron McKee did win Sixth Man of the Year. I'm not saying these guys were all of them were bums. I'm not saying that. But offensively, yeah, they couldn't score. They just were not guys that scored the basketball very well. I'm not saying that occasionally they didn't knock down a three or a jumper, of course, but consistently, no, they were not. This was a team that hung their hat on defense, and Matumbo was there not only to play defense and block shots, but also to get a lot of those misses because AI did miss a lot because of the circumstances involved. Okay, so offensive rebound putbacks or offensive rebounds and kickouts to have another possession is also very important. That's why a guy like Matumbo is so valuable. If you don't have that, because like I said before, the battle in those days were one in the trenches, rebounding, offensive rebounding, and getting to the foul line were pivotal for victories back in that time. Whereas today, it's more of a three-point thing. Whoever hit the most threes, hey, you're going to win. Back then, it was a battle in the trenches. It was war. It was war. It was sacrifice. It was a game of Battle. Mm, yeah. Mm. But as things do, they change. Times change, and in the mid 2000s, the NBA began to make rule changes, which made perimeter scoring easier. That's why 2005, 2006, which is the first year you saw those changes really take off. That's why you saw Paul Pierce have a career year. That's why you saw Gilbert Arenas all of a sudden emerge from being a 20 points per game scorer to suddenly becoming a guy averaging 28, 29, 30. That's why you saw Kobe. He was already great, don't get me wrong, but he was averaging more like 27, 28, 30. Now all of a sudden he's averaging 36, 35, 81. You know, even Steve Nash, who was a solid point guard before that, maybe averaging 13 points and 7.5, 8 assists. Now all of a sudden he becomes a guy averaging 17 and 11 assists. And even Iverson, who was 31 years old, had his best season. He averaged 33 points a game, but he shot 45% from the floor, which was a career high. And he had his best shooting seasons afterwards because the game changed. Defenses were no longer as stifling, and perimeter scorers had an easier time of scoring the basketball. But at the same time, however, the dominating seasons of guys like Shaq, and Ewing, and in that sense, that was beginning to diminish. The days of Tim Duncan and Kevin Garnett, all these guys having all these great scoring years, was beginning to diminish. As a matter of fact, even guys like Tim Duncan and Garnett, even they weren't as efficient as you would hope they would be. They were around 49, 50% shooting. But in today's environment, if they were just shooting the shots they were shooting now, they'd probably be in the mid 50s percentage. Look at Giannis. Giannis isn't nearly as skilled as those guys are. And look what he shoots. Now I want to address one other thing, okay? There's one other thing I want to address, and that is these allegations that Iverson was responsible for the Nuggets not advancing past the Lakers in 2009. Now, first of all, we have to remember that the Lakers won 65 games, if I'm not mistaken, in 2009. So nobody expected the Nuggets to beat that team. But if you really want to put blame on anybody, maybe you should put blame on George Karl putting Linus Kleezer, I think that was his name, right? Linus Kleezer in the starting lineup, who couldn't play defense for a lick. He could score, but he couldn't play defense, and he allowed Luke Walton to average 14 points a game during that series. Luke Walton, one of the biggest bums in the history of the NBA, averaged 14 points in that series. Matter of fact, I think he had two double doubles in that goddamn series. So maybe we need to blame George Karl for that. Maybe they would have been a little bit more competitive. But Allen Iverson's career field goal percentage of 42.5%, when you combine the era they played in, the circumstances, team, the league average field goal percentage, and the fact that he was so diminutive in size, 5'11", it's actually a pretty good field goal percentage. You know what I'm saying? That's my take on it. You know what I'm saying? Some people may not agree with that, but you know, I think I present at least a pretty compelling case. If you disagree with it, but tell me what you guys think.